Ethan Brooks didn't consider himself the jealous type. After all, jealousy was for the insecure, the untrusting, the emotionally immature, and Ethan had convinced himself he was none of those things. At 28, he had a steady career as a graphic designer, a respectable circle of friends, and a relationship with Claire Watson that had weathered the ups and downs of 4 years. But lately, there was a crack in the foundation of his life, and it was growing wider by the day. Started small. Claire had developed a strange attachment to the corner convenience store, a dingy little place called Harlan's Market. The shop was nothing special. Flickering fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum floors, and a predictable rotation of overpriced snacks. Yet Claire had begun making trips there almost daily. Again, Ethan asked one evening as she grabbed her coat. He was sprawled on their worn leather couch, half watching a rerun of Parks and Recreation. "I forgot eggs," she replied, stuffing her wallet into her purse. "We have eggs. I just bought a dozen yesterday," Ethan countered, frowning. "Organic eggs," Claire clarified, as if that explained everything. She kissed him quickly on the cheek. "Be back in 10. It was never 10. The next day, Ethan found himself at Harlan's Market on his lunch break. He hadn't planned to go, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and he was greeted by the smell of stale coffee and the low hum of an ancient air conditioner. Behind the counter stood Ryan Nash. Ethan had seen him before. A tall guy in his early 30s with messy black hair and an effortless kind of charm. He wore a faded t-shirt with the store's logo and leaned on the counter as if the world couldn't rush him. "Hey," Ryan said, his tone casual as he rang up a customer's purchase. "Need help finding anything?" Ethan shook his head and made his way to the back, pretending to browse. As he picked up a bag of pretzels he didn't want, he overheard Ryan chatting with a middle-aged woman at the counter. "Your usual?" Ryan asked her, sliding a lottery ticket across the counter. "Good luck this time." Ethan forced himself to relax. There was nothing unusual about the guy, he was just friendly. Claire probably liked the convenience store because it was close and unassuming. There was no reason to think. "Hey, Claire." The sound of her name stopped Ethan cold. He turned, gripping the pretzel bag as if it were a lifeline. Claire was walking through the door, a light smile on her lips, and she looked entirely too comfortable. Ryan greeted her like an old friend, and for a split second, Ethan wondered if she'd noticed him standing there. But she didn't. "You're back," Ryan said, leaning forward on the counter. "Couldn't resist," Claire replied, and there was a softness in her voice Ethan hadn't heard in a long time. By the time Ethan returned home that night, the pretzel bag still unopened in his car, he was caught in a loop of overthinking. He told himself there was nothing to worry about. Claire was friendly, that's all. She was the kind of person who got along with everyone, whether it was the barista at her favorite coffee shop or the guy at Harlan's Market. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the image of her smile, the one she used to give him. As the days passed, her trips to the store became more frequent. "Didn't you just go there yesterday?" Ethan asked one evening, his voice laced with a frustration he couldn't quite hide. Claire looked up from her phone, her expression neutral. "What's the big deal? I like their coffee. And it's not like I'm spending a fortune." Ethan nodded, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. One night, Ethan decided to press the issue. "I'll come with you," he offered casually as Claire reached for her keys. She paused, her hand hovering over the counter. "You don't have to. It's just a quick trip." "I don't mind," Ethan insisted. Claire hesitated, and in that moment, Ethan felt something shift between them. It was subtle, like the faint crack of ice underfoot, but he knew it meant something. "Maybe next time," she said, offering a tight smile before slipping out the door. That was when Ethan realized he was losing her. It wasn't something he could explain to his friends without sounding paranoid. It wasn't something he could confront Claire about without risking an argument. But the signs were there, in her growing distance, in her newfound attachment to Harlan's Market, in the way she smiled when she thought he wasn't looking. Ethan had always believed in trust, but now he wasn't sure if trust alone was enough. For the first time in their 4 years together, Ethan felt the sharp sting of doubt. And he knew it wouldn't go away until he found out the truth. The following days dragged by, each one pulling Ethan deeper into a swamp of unease. Claire's frequent trips to Harlan's Market didn't stop, and her explanations became vaguer. Worse, Ethan began to notice other things. Small changes in her behavior that collectively felt like the tip of a much larger iceberg. For starters, Claire's phone was now glued to her hand. Not that this was unusual for someone in their 20s, but Ethan couldn't help but notice how she angled the screen away when he walked by. Once, he caught a glimpse of her typing a message, her face alight with a smile that wasn't for him. "Who's that?" he asked casually. She locked the phone and shrugged. "Just Maya," she replied, referring to her best friend from college. "She's going through a thing with her boyfriend." Ethan nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right. Claire's laughter moments earlier had sounded light, carefree. The kind of laugh she hadn't shared with him in weeks. The next time Claire left for the store, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. Once her car disappeared down the street, he grabbed his jacket and followed on foot, keeping a safe distance. It felt absurd, like something out of a bad detective movie, but the gnawing doubt in his chest drove him forward. When he arrived at Harlan's Market, he ducked behind a newspaper stand and peered through the smudged glass windows. Claire was at the counter, chatting with Ryan. It was the same smile as before, that soft, almost shy grin Ethan hadn't seen in ages. Ryan, for his part, was leaning casually against the counter, his body language loose and open. He said something that made Claire laugh, and the sound sent a spike of anger through Ethan's chest. The exchange didn't last long. Claire bought a cup of coffee and left, her steps light as she walked to her car. Ethan waited until she was gone before stepping into the store. The bell above the door jingled as Ethan entered, and Ryan looked up from the register. "Hey there," Ryan greeted, his tone friendly but detached. Ethan grabbed a pack of gum from a nearby display and walked to the counter, his eyes scanning Ryan's face for anything suspicious. Up close, Ryan looked even more relaxed than Ethan remembered, like someone who never took life too seriously. "You get a lot of regulars in here?" Ethan asked, sliding the gum across the counter. "Some," Ryan replied, ringing up the purchase. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just curious. My girlfriend seems to like this place." Ryan's lips quirked into a small smile, but he didn't say anything. "You know Claire?" Ethan pressed, watching Ryan's reaction carefully. "Yeah, she comes in a lot," Ryan said after a brief pause. "She's nice." Nice. The word hung in the air, its simplicity grating on Ethan's nerves. He wanted to ask more, to push harder, but he knew he couldn't without tipping his hand. "Cool," Ethan said instead, forcing a tight smile. As he left the store, the gum still unopened in his pocket, Ethan's mind raced. Ryan's reaction had been calm, too calm. That evening, Ethan decided to test Claire's story. "Did you see Maya today?" he asked casually over dinner. Claire glanced up from her plate, her expression neutral. "No, she was busy with work." "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Just curious. You seem to be texting her a lot." Claire's eyes flickered, just for a second, and Ethan felt a grim sense of satisfaction. "She needed advice earlier, that's all," Claire said, her tone light. Ethan nodded, but he wasn't satisfied. The next day, Ethan went a step further. He left work early and drove to Harlan's Market, parking a few blocks away. He waited in his car, sipping a lukewarm coffee, until Claire's blue sedan pulled into the lot. She stepped out and walked into the store, her pace unhurried. Ethan waited 5 minutes before following her inside. When he entered, the bell jingled again, and this time, Claire turned. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Hey," Ethan said, feigning casualness. "Didn't expect to see you here." Claire recovered quickly, her expression smoothing out. "I was just grabbing a coffee," she said, holding up the cup in her hand. "What about you?" "Same thing," Ethan replied, moving to the counter. Ryan glanced between them, his expression unreadable. "Hey!" he said to Ethan, his tone neutral. Ethan ordered a coffee, his eyes flicking briefly to Claire. She was watching him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Well," she said after a moment, "I should get going. See you at home." Ethan nodded, and she left without another word. As the door swung shut behind her, Ethan turned to Ryan. "She's here a lot," Ethan said, his voice deliberately casual. Ryan shrugged, wiping the counter with a rag. "Like I said, she's nice." The words felt like a slap. By the time Ethan returned home that evening, he was more certain than ever that something was going on. Claire was distant again, her conversation minimal. When Ethan asked about her day, she gave short, vague answers that left him feeling more alone than ever. That night, as Claire slept beside him, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He didn't want to believe it, but the signs were all there. Claire was hiding something, and Ethan was going to find out what. Ethan felt like he was losing his grip on reality. Each passing day magnified his suspicion, his anxiety, and the sinking feeling in his chest. By now, Claire's daily visits to Harlan's Market felt less like errands and more like deliberate escapes. He didn't have hard evidence, just a gut feeling that grew heavier every time he saw her smile at her phone or heard the faint chime of a message late at night. On Wednesday evening, he finally snapped. "You're going to the store again?" Ethan asked as Claire reached for her coat. "Yeah, we're out of milk," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. Ethan clenched his jaw. "We still have half a carton in the fridge." Claire froze, her hand still on the coat. "It's expired." "Since when?" She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you being weird about this?" "I'm not being weird," Ethan said, standing from the couch. "I just think it's strange that you've been going to that store every single day. What's so special about it?" Claire crossed her arms, her expression shifting to defensive. "I like the coffee, and sometimes I just want to get out of the house, Ethan. Is that a crime?" "It's not about the coffee," he said, his voice rising. "It's about you acting like I'm crazy for noticing how much time you spend there." Claire sighed, shaking her head. "You know what? I'm not doing this with you right now." She grabbed her keys and walked out, slamming the door behind her. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled on his jacket. This time, he wasn't going to let her slip away without answers. He followed her car at a safe distance, his headlights off as he crept down the darkened suburban streets. When she pulled into the Harlan's Market parking lot, Ethan parked a block away and killed the engine. He watched as Claire got out of the car and walked inside, her pace unhurried, her body language relaxed. For a moment, Ethan just sat there, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he expected to see, but the not knowing was worse than anything he could imagine. After a few minutes, he got out of the car and approached the store. Through the large glass windows, Ethan saw Claire standing near the counter, laughing. Ryan was behind the register, leaning forward slightly as if they were sharing a private joke. Ethan's stomach twisted. He pushed the door open, the bell jingling loudly. Claire turned, her smile faltering the instant she saw him. "Ethan?" she said, her voice tinged with confusion. "Hey," he replied, his tone sharp. "Didn't realize this was the comedy club." Ryan straightened, his expression cautious but calm. "Need help with something?" "No," Ethan said, his eyes locked on Claire. "Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about." Claire glanced between the two men, her cheeks flushing. "I was just grabbing coffee," she said quickly. "Sure," Ethan replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Coffee must be hilarious." Ryan cleared his throat. "Look, man, I think you're—" "I'm not talking to you," Ethan snapped, cutting him off. Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender. Claire's eyes flashed with anger. "What is your problem?" "My problem," Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "My problem is that my girlfriend is spending all her free time here, laughing at jokes I don't get and acting like I'm crazy for noticing." Claire opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her expression shifting to something that looked like guilt. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe you two should take this outside." "No," Ethan said, turning to him. I think we should settle this right here. What's going on between you two? Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Nothing's going on, man. She's a regular customer, that's it. Ethan, stop, Claire said, her voice low and urgent. No, I won't stop, Ethan shot back. Not until I get the truth. Claire grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, her grip firm. We're leaving, she said through gritted teeth. Once they were outside, Ethan yanked his arm free. You're hiding something, he said, his voice trembling. I'm not stupid, Claire. She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me the truth. For a moment, she just stared at him, her face a mixture of frustration and something else. Something softer, like regret. Fine, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I like talking to him, okay? He's funny. And sometimes it's nice to have someone to talk to who doesn't judge me or make me feel like I'm doing something wrong all the time. Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. So you're saying this is my fault? No, I'm saying... She hesitated, looking away. I don't know what I'm saying. That's not good enough, Ethan said, his voice breaking. Claire shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm going home. She walked to her car and drove off, leaving Ethan standing alone in the cold night air. Ethan didn't go home right away. Instead, he sat in his car, staring at the dimly lit convenience store. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Claire's words had stung, but they hadn't given him any real answers. After a while, he got out of the car and walked back into the store. Ryan looked up, his expression wary. Back again. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He walked to the counter and placed his hands on it, leaning forward. You're lying. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You're lying about her just being a regular customer, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. I can see it in the way you look at her. So why don't you cut the crap and tell me the truth? Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Too late for that, Ethan said. For a moment, Ryan said nothing. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet. If you think something's going on, maybe you should be asking her. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. You're a coward, he spat. Ryan shrugged. Maybe, but I'm not the one who's losing her. Those words echoed in Ethan's mind as he drove home that night. When he walked through the door, Claire was already asleep on the couch, her face peaceful and untroubled. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at her. Something had broken between them, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be fixed. Ethan couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the creak of the old wood floors. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at Claire's empty side. She hadn't come upstairs after falling asleep on the couch. It had been hours since their fight outside the convenience store, but Ryan's parting words still echoed in his mind. I'm not the one who's losing her. Ethan clenched his fists, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Ryan had said it so casually, as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if Ethan had already lost. But not yet. The next morning, Ethan woke up determined. He needed proof, something tangible that would either confirm his worst fears or put them to rest. Without it, he was stuck in a loop of doubt and suspicion that was slowly driving him mad. Claire had left for work early, her goodbye perfunctory and distant. As soon as she was gone, Ethan got to work. Ethan started with the trash. He combed through the small bin under the sink, sorting through crumpled receipts, used napkins, and empty coffee cups. After a few minutes, he found what he was looking for, several receipts from Harlan's Market. Most of them were for small items. A coffee, a candy bar, a pack of gum. But one stood out. It was dated a week ago and listed a single, oddly specific purchase. A six-pack of a local craft beer Ethan didn't drink. He stared at it, his mind racing. Claire hated beer. She always said it tasted like liquid bread. So why was she buying it? And who was it for? Ethan hesitated for a long moment before reaching for Claire's phone. It was sitting on the coffee table, plugged into the charger. He knew it was a violation of her privacy, but the nagging questions in his head outweighed his guilt. He unlocked the phone with her passcode, a habit she'd formed early in their relationship, when they trusted each other implicitly. Her messages were the first place he looked. The usual suspects were there: Maya, her mom, a group chat with some coworkers. But then he saw a name that made his stomach twist. *Ryan Nash. Ethan opened the thread, his hands trembling. The messages were casual at first, short exchanges about coffee recommendations and local restaurants. But as he scrolled further, the tone shifted. Ryan, you're way too good to be stuck with someone who doesn't appreciate you. Claire, it's not that simple. Ryan, maybe it should be. Life's too short to settle. Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The messages weren't overtly romantic, but there was an intimacy to them, an emotional connection that stung more than any physical betrayal. He kept scrolling, each new message a fresh wound. Claire, thanks for listening tonight. I needed that. Ryan, anytime. You deserve to be happy. Ethan locked the phone and set it down, his chest heaving. That evening, Ethan decided to follow Claire again. He knew it was risky. If she caught him, it could blow up whatever remained of their relationship, but he needed answers. When she left the house around 8 p.m., Ethan waited 5 minutes before grabbing his keys and heading out. As expected, she went to Harlan's Market. But this time, she didn't stay inside. Instead, she parked her car and walked around to the back of the building. Ethan's pulse quickened as he parked a safe distance away and got out of his car. Keeping to the shadows, he crept around the side of the building, his heart pounding in his ears. What he saw made his blood run cold. Claire was standing close to Ryan, her arms crossed over her chest. They were talking, their voices low and urgent, but Ethan couldn't make out the words. Then Ryan reached out and touched her arm, his fingers lingering for just a moment too long. Ethan's vision blurred with rage. He wanted to storm over there, to demand an explanation, but something held him back. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo, the flash off. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. He watched as Claire and Ryan moved closer, their voices still too quiet to hear. Then Claire laughed softly, the sound cutting through the night like a knife. Ethan turned and walked away, his hands trembling. By the time Claire got home, Ethan was ready. He sat at the kitchen table, the photo pulled up on his phone. You were with him, he said as soon as she walked through the door. Claire froze, her eyes widening. What? Don't play dumb, Ethan said, his voice cold. He held up his phone, showing her the photo. Her face paled. Ethan, I can explain. Then explain, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Explain why you've been sneaking around with him behind my back. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. It's not what you think, she said softly. Then what is it? Ethan demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for weeks. Claire took a deep breath, her hands trembling. I didn't cheat on you, she said. I swear. Then what the hell were you doing with him? I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. He listens to me, Ethan. He makes me feel seen. Ethan stared at her, his heart breaking. And I don't. Claire didn't answer. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't do this, he said, his voice shaking. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. Claire wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? Ethan asked. For lying? Or for getting caught? She didn't reply, and that told him everything he needed to know. Ethan grabbed his keys and left, the door slamming shut behind him. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay there. Not when the life he'd built with Claire was crumbling before his eyes. As he drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, his mind raced. He'd thought he wanted the truth, but now that he had it, he wasn't sure what to do with it. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car, parked in a deserted lot near the edge of town, replaying every conversation, every laugh, every touch he'd witnessed between Claire and Ryan. It wasn't just betrayal he felt. It was the humiliation of being the last to see what was right in front of him. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he'd made up his mind. He wasn't going to let it end like this, with half-truths and tears. If Claire wouldn't give him the answers he deserved, he'd go straight to the source. When Ethan walked into Harlan's Market later that morning, Ryan was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. The store was empty, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the worn linoleum floors. Ryan looked up as Ethan approached, his expression neutral. "Morning," he said, his tone casual. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hard. Ryan raised an eyebrow, setting his phone down. "About what?" "You know damn well what," Ethan replied, stepping closer. "About Claire. About whatever it is you think you're doing with her." Ryan sighed, leaning back against the counter. "Look, man, I already told you." "Don't," Ethan snapped, cutting him off. "Don't lie to me again. I've seen the messages. I've seen the way you look at her." Ryan's jaw tightened, his casual demeanor slipping. "And what do you want me to say? That I like her? Fine. I like her. She's smart and funny and way too good for someone like you." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut, but he refused to back down. "You don't know anything about us," he said through gritted teeth. Ryan scoffed. "I know enough. I know she's miserable. She told me how you're always working, how you don't listen to her anymore." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "That doesn't give you the right to come between us." Ryan stepped out from behind the counter, his posture tense. "Maybe not. But if she's unhappy, that's on you, not me." The tension in the air was suffocating. Ethan's hands itched to hit something, to hit Ryan, but he knew it wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he forced himself to take a step back, his breath coming in sharp, angry bursts. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay away from her." Ryan didn't respond, his expression unreadable. When Ethan got home, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in her hands. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "Talking to your boyfriend," Ethan replied coldly, tossing his keys onto the counter. Claire flinched at his words. "Ethan, please." "Don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't try to justify it. I've heard enough excuses." Claire's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked so small, so defeated, that Ethan almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it did," Ethan said, his tone harsh. "You let it happen, and now here we are." Claire wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. "I don't know how we got here," she admitted. I felt so alone, Ethan. And Ryan was there, and he listened." Ethan's chest ached, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I would have listened," he said quietly, "if you'd just talked to me." Claire shook her head, her voice trembling. "I tried, but you were always so busy, so focused on work, and I didn't want to be a burden." Ethan stared at her, his anger giving way to something softer, something more painful. He thought back to all the nights he'd stayed late at the office, all the times he'd brushed off her concerns with a quick, "We'll talk later." "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know," Claire whispered. Just as the silence between them became unbearable, Claire took a deep breath and looked up at him. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her voice shaking. Ethan frowned, his stomach sinking. "What?" She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Ryan, he told me he loves me." Ethan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "And what did you say?" Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I didn't say it back, but I didn't stop him either." Ethan turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. He felt like he was drowning, the weight of her confession pulling him under. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice hollow. You should have told me before it got this far. I know, Claire said, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you. Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. It's too late for that. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to fight for Claire, to fix whatever had broken between them. But another part of him, the part that felt betrayed and humiliated, wanted to walk away and never look back. As dawn broke, Ethan made his decision. He got out of bed and packed a bag, his movements slow and deliberate. When Claire woke up, she found him standing by the door, his keys in hand. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. "I need space," he said simply. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please. I can't do this right now," he said, cutting her off. "I need to think." And with that, he walked out, leaving Claire standing alone in the doorway. The first night away was the hardest. Ethan had checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town, its walls thin enough to let him hear the muffled arguments of the couple next door and the occasional buzz of a flickering neon sign outside. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone, Claire's name hovering at the top of his recent calls. He didn't call her. Instead, he scrolled through their old photos, the ones that documented the happier times. A weekend trip to Chicago, lazy Sundays at home, the anniversary dinner where she'd worn that red dress he loved. It all felt so far away now, like a life that belonged to someone else. By the second night, the anger began to creep back in. Ethan couldn't stay in limbo forever. Claire had hurt him, yes, but it was Ryan who had inserted himself into their lives, who had crossed lines he had no business crossing. The next morning, Ethan drove to Harlan's Market, his jaw set and his fists clenched around the steering wheel. Ryan was behind the counter when Ethan walked in, his easy demeanor immediately replaced with unease. "Not you again," Ryan muttered under his breath, straightening up. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. He marched straight to the counter, his eyes blazing. "We need to finish this," Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man, I've already said everything I have to say." "You haven't said enough," Ethan shot back. "You think it's okay to mess with someone else's relationship? To whisper in her ear about how much better you are?" Ryan crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "I didn't force her to come to me. She made that choice." Ethan's fist slammed down on the counter, rattling the candy display. "She made that choice because you encouraged her. You fed into her doubts, her insecurities, because you wanted her for yourself." Ryan's face darkened. "You think this is all on me? Maybe if you treated her the way she deserves, she wouldn't have come to me in the first place." Ethan stared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment, he considered throwing a punch, but he stopped himself. Ryan wasn't worth it. "You don't get to play the hero in this," Ethan said, his voice cold. "You're just a coward who couldn't find someone of his own." Ryan didn't respond, and Ethan turned on his heel, walking out of the store without another word. Ethan spent the next few days thinking about what Ryan had said. As much as he hated to admit it, there was a grain of truth buried in the accusation. He hadn't been the best partner to Claire. He'd taken her for granted, assuming she'd always be there, no matter how many late nights he worked or how many conversations he brushed aside. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. Ethan realized that the problem wasn't just Ryan or Claire. It was the cracks in their relationship that had gone unnoticed for far too long. On the fifth day, Ethan returned home. Claire was sitting on the couch when he walked in, her eyes red and tired. She looked up, startled, as he set his bag down by the door. "You're back," she said softly. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice neutral. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavily between them. Finally, Claire spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice trembling, "about us, about everything." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Me too. I know I hurt you," she continued, tears welling up in her eyes, "and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I need you to know that it wasn't because I didn't love you. I do. I got lost." Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "You should have come to me," he said. "We could have worked through it together." "I know," Claire whispered, wiping at her tears. "I was scared, and I made the wrong choice." They sat in silence again, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. "I don't know if we can fix this," Ethan said finally, his voice breaking. "There's too much damage." Claire nodded, her face crumpling. "I understand." In the end, they both knew what had to be done. Their love had been real, but it wasn't enough to undo the hurt and betrayal. Ethan moved out the following week, finding a small apartment on the other side of town. He and Claire didn't speak often after that, their lives slowly diverging as they each tried to rebuild. As for Ryan, Ethan never saw him again. Harlan's market eventually closed, and the building was left vacant, a silent reminder of everything that had happened. The twist. Months later, Ethan received a message from an unfamiliar number. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're doing okay." It was Claire. Ethan stared at the message for a long time before typing a reply. "I am. I hope you are too." He sent it, then deleted her number. As he set his phone down, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally free.